Welcome back to Unknown Suspect, where every mystery rewards patience and every detail demands attention. Tonight's story invites you into a world of quiet tension, careful observation, and subtle deception. Settle in, sharpen your instincts, and follow the clues that others miss. In Unknown Suspect, no moment is accidental, no silence is empty, and the truth always waits for the right time to reveal itself. The Silent Chime by Hercule Poirot. Chapter 1. A House. Ruled by time. Hercule Poirot disliked surprises. He disliked them intensely. Life, in his view, functioned best when events followed an orderly pattern, each moment fitting neatly into the next, like pieces of a well-constructed puzzle. For this reason alone, the letter from Sir Lionel Harrington had intrigued him. It was written in a firm, educated hand, its phrasing polite but faintly strained. Sir Lionel, a renowned horologist and collector of antique clocks, requested Poirot's presence at his country home, Belvoir Chase. He spoke of unease, of matters best discussed in person, and of a feeling that something under his roof had begun to move against its proper course. There was no mention of crime, nor of danger, only a sense of disquiet that lingered between the lines. Poirot had read the letter twice, then a third time before placing it carefully into his pocket. Unease, he reflected, was often the first whisper of truth. Belvoir Chase lay some distance from London, set amid rolling countryside and framed by tall, dark trees that seemed to stand guard over the house. As Poirot's motorcar approached, he observed the structure with a practiced eye. It was handsome, rather than grand, built of pale stone, its windows tall and narrow. Nothing about it suggested neglect. On the contrary, it appeared maintained with almost excessive care. Sir Lionel Harrington himself awaited Poirot at the door. He was a man in his early 60s, slender, upright, and meticulously dressed. His hair, once dark, had faded to grey, and his eyes were sharp but restless. "Monsieur Poirot," he said warmly, clasping Poirot's hand, "you are most kind to come on such short notice." Poirot inclined his head. "When a gentleman writes to me of unease, I listen. The mind, you see, is often aware before the facts make themselves known." Sir Lionel smiled faintly, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "That is precisely my fear." Inside, the house revealed its true character. Clocks were everywhere. Mantel clocks lined the walls of the entrance hall. A long case clock stood proudly near the staircase. Smaller clocks occupied tables, shelves, and window ledges. Each was different in style and age, yet all gleamed with careful attention. Poirot paused, listening. The ticking did not form a single rhythm. It overlapped, competing softly, as though each clock insisted upon its own authority. "Remarkable," Poirot said gently. Sir Lionel sighed. "They are my life's work, and lately my torment." Poirot raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he was shown to his room. Even there, upon the bedside table, stood a modest carriage clock, its face clean and exact. Poirot adjusted it minutely, so it sat perfectly square. Later, at dinner, the household assembled. Sir Lionel presided at the head of the table, though his attention seemed divided, flickering now and again toward the clock above the fireplace. First was introduced Eleanor Harrington, Sir Lionel's niece. She was a woman of quiet intelligence, her expression thoughtful rather than shy. Poirot noticed her observant eyes, which took in others without drawing attention to themselves. Next came Captain Hugh Calder, a broad-shouldered man with an easy manner that sat uneasily upon him, like a coat worn for too long. His smile was charming, but faintly brittle. Miss Violet Penn, Sir Lionel's secretary, followed. She was precise in movement and speech, dressed plainly but neatly, her posture upright. Poirot noted at once her air of efficiency, and the way she watched her employer before speaking. Lastly came Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, whose manner was respectful and steady. She had the look of a woman who had seen much and chosen to remember little. Conversation at dinner was polite, even pleasant, yet beneath it Poirot sensed tension, like a wire pulled too tight. Sir Lionel corrected the time announced by a clock chiming in the next room. Miss Penn smiled a fraction too quickly. Captain Calder laughed a little too loudly at a remark that was not especially amusing. Poirot spoke sparingly, observing instead. He noticed how Sir Lionel stiffened whenever a clock chimed a second late, how Eleanor's gaze lingered on her uncle as though weighing unspoken thoughts, how Miss Penn's hand strayed instinctively to the small key that hung on a fine chain at her waist, a key of a type Poirot recognized at once. After dinner, coffee was served in the drawing-room. Sir Lionel excused himself earlier than expected, complaining of a headache. "These evenings," he said, pressing his fingers briefly to his temple, "do not sit well with me of late." Poirot watched him leave, noting the tension in his shoulders. Later, as Poirot prepared for bed, the house settled into quiet. The clocks continued their soft insistence, filling the silence with layered sound. Poirot stood for a moment by his window, reflecting. Then he heard it. A faint sound in the corridor. Not footsteps, but something more deliberate. A careful movement. Then a soft click, metal against metal. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Someone, he thought, was tending the clocks when all should have been asleep. He did not open his door, he did not call out. Instead, he smiled faintly to himself. "A house ruled by time," he murmured, adjusting his moustache with satisfaction. "And yet someone here believes they may control it." He returned to his bed, his mind already arranging facts that had not yet fully revealed themselves. Where time is interfered with, Poirot knew, truth is rarely far behind. And at Belvoir Chase, time had begun to misbehave. Chapter 2. Death Before the Hour. Morning arrived at Belvoir Chase with deceptive calm. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the quiet corridors and the many polished clock faces that lined the walls. Their ticking, steady and persistent, seemed almost reassuring after the restless night. Hercule Poirot rose at precisely 7:30. He washed, dressed with his usual care, and adjusted his moustache until each side matched the other exactly. Only then did he turn his attention outward. Something in the house felt altered, not in any obvious way, but in the subtle manner that troubled Poirot far more than open disorder. It was the silence. One of the clocks in his room had stopped. Poirot noticed it at once. The small carriage clock on his bedside table showed 7 minutes past 6. He picked it up, listening. No ticking. He frowned slightly, but did not touch the mechanism. Instead, he placed it carefully back where it stood. "Interesting," he murmured. He stepped into the corridor. There, too, the sound seemed thinner. Not absent, but uneven. Some clocks ticked, others did not. The harmony of the previous evening, discordant though it had been, was broken. Poirot had taken only a few steps toward the staircase when a sharp cry rang out from below. "Sir Lionel!" It was Mrs. Briggs's voice, usually so controlled, now edged with alarm. Poirot descended at once, his movements quick but composed. In the hall, Eleanor Harrington stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Captain Calder hovered uncertainly near the doorway to the clock gallery. Miss Penn stood very straight, her face pale but unreadable. Mrs. Briggs emerged slowly from the gallery, her expression stricken. "It's Sir Lionel," she said. "He won't wake." Poirot entered the gallery. It was a long, narrow room, its walls lined with Sir Lionel's most prized clocks. At the far end, beneath a tall, long-case clock of dark wood, Sir Lionel Harrington sat in a high-backed chair. His posture was oddly dignified, as though he had simply paused in thought. Poirot approached quietly. One glance told him what the others already feared. Sir Lionel was dead. There was no sign of disturbance, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no marks of violence. The room was immaculate, the clocks polished, the air faintly scented with oil and old wood. Poirot's gaze lifted to the long case clock above the chair. Its pendulum was still. The hands rested precisely on 11 o'clock. He turned slowly, taking in the rest of the room. Every clock in the gallery had stopped, not together, but separately. One showed 11 minutes past 11, another 14 minutes past, a third almost half past the hour. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "This is not," he said softly, "the work of chance." The local doctor arrived first, summoned from the village. After a brief examination, he shook his head gravely. "Sudden death," he said. "Heart failure, perhaps. There are no obvious signs of anything else." Poirot did not contradict him. Instead, he observed the reactions of the others. Captain Calder sank into a chair, rubbing his forehead. "Good Lord," he muttered. "I was speaking to him only last night." Eleanor stood very still, her eyes fixed on her uncle's face. Her expression was not dramatic, but Poirot noticed the tension in her hands, clenched tightly together. Miss Penn spoke at last. "Sir Lionel was under great strain," she said. "He worked far too hard. I often urged him to rest." Her voice was calm, but Poirot noted how carefully she avoided looking at the clocks. Inspector Webb of the county police arrived shortly thereafter. He was a solid man, practical and courteous, though inclined toward simple explanations. "No sign of a struggle," he said, glancing around. "No reason at present to suspect foul play." Poirot inclined his head politely. "And yet, Inspector, there are details which invite reflection." Webb followed Poirot's gaze to the stopped clocks. "Yes, well," he said, "perhaps a fault in the mechanism. Old houses are full of surprises." "Indeed," Poirot replied, "but faults, Inspector, rarely show such variety." The inspector frowned slightly but made a note. Each member of the household was asked to account for their movements the previous night. Captain Calder stated he had gone out into the garden after dinner to smoke, returning directly to his room. Eleanor said she had spent the evening reading, unable to sleep. Miss Penn claimed she had been organizing Sir Lionel's correspondence in her room. Mrs. Briggs had retired early, suffering from a headache. All reasonable, all unprovable. Poirot listened carefully, asking only gentle, clarifying questions. He observed how Calder's story came quickly as though prepared. How Eleanor hesitated, searching her memory. How Miss Penn's answers were precise to the minute, time again. When the others were dismissed, Poirot requested permission to examine the gallery more closely. Inspector Webb agreed, curious despite himself. Poirot moved slowly, his eyes missing nothing. He examined the clocks without touching them, noting their positions, their stopped hands, their condition. Finally, he bent to examine the base of the long case clock above Sir Lionel's chair. There, almost invisible unless one knew where to look, was a tiny scratch near the access panel. Poirot straightened. "Inspector," he said quietly, "tell me, are you aware that clocks may be persuaded to lie?" Webb looked at him sharply. "You mean tampered with?" Poirot smiled. "I mean persuaded." The body was removed later that morning. The gallery felt emptier without Sir Lionel's presence, though the stopped clocks lent it a strange stillness, as though the room itself were holding its breath. As the household dispersed, Poirot remained behind a moment. He stood beneath the long case clock, listening to the faint ticking of others in distant rooms. "Death before the hour," he murmured thoughtfully. "And a man who feared betrayal." He left the gallery at last, his mind already working. Sir Lionel Harrington had not died by accident, not in Poirot's world. The clocks had stopped, and someone, Poirot was certain, had wanted time itself to give false testimony. Chapter 3. The Weight of Inheritance. Death, Hercule Poirot reflected, had a curious way of rearranging people's priorities. Grief came first, of course, at least in appearance, but soon afterward followed calculation, fear, and expectation. At Belvoir Chase, these quieter emotions moved like shadows beneath polite expressions. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a strained calm. Sir Lionel's body had been removed, yet his presence lingered in every ticking clock and polished surface. Poirot seated himself in the small morning room, where light fell generously across a low table. He preferred such spaces, bright, orderly, honest. Inspector Webb joined him, notebook in hand. "The solicitor will be arriving this afternoon," Webb said. "There's a will. Sir Lionel revised it not long ago, apparently." Poirot's eyes lifted. "Ah, that is often instructive." The reading of the will took place shortly after luncheon. The solicitor, a thin man with a careful manner, conducted the proceedings with professional restraint. The household gathered in the drawing room, seated at measured distances from one another. Sir Lionel's estate, it emerged, was substantial. The house and the bulk of his fortune were left to Eleanor Harrington. There was a small allowance for Captain Calder, described as a gesture of old friendship. Mrs. Briggs received a modest but generous pension. Finally, Miss Penn was named beneficiary of something more unusual, the rights to one of Sir Lionel's unfinished clock designs, a mechanism he had guarded closely and valued highly. Poirot observed the reactions. Captain Calder's expression tightened before he masked it with a shrug. Eleanor looked surprised, then troubled. Miss Penn inclined her head slightly as though the result merely confirmed what she had expected. "Thank you," she said quietly. The solicitor departed, leaving behind a heavier silence than before. Later that afternoon, Poirot spoke privately with each member of the household. Captain Calder received him first. The former officer paced the room as he spoke, his movements restless. "I never expected to inherit much," he said. "Lionel was always careful with money. Still, I won't pretend I'm not disappointed." "Disappointment," Poirot replied mildly, "is not a crime." Calder stopped pacing and laughed sharply. "You think I killed him for money?" "I think nothing yet," Poirot said. "I listen." Calder exhaled, rubbing his face. He was under strain, Poirot. Paranoid at times. Thought someone was cheating him. I told him to let it go. Poirot noted the phrasing. Thought someone was cheating him. Eleanor Harrington spoke next. She was composed, but Poirot sensed effort behind the calm. "My uncle changed his will after a disagreement," she said slowly. "He would not tell me with whom." "You disagreed also?" Poirot asked gently. "Yes," she admitted. "About the business. He suspected dishonesty, but I urged him to be cautious. Accusations can destroy reputations." Poirot nodded. "And did he agree?" She hesitated. He said time would reveal the truth. Time again. Miss Penn was the last to be interviewed. She sat very straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Sir Lionel trusted me," she said. "I managed his correspondence, his accounts, his appointments. I would never betray that trust." Poirot studied her carefully. "Trust is a delicate instrument, Miss Penn, like a clock. It works only while all parts move in harmony." Her smile was polite, controlled. If you suggest I had something to gain—" "I suggest nothing," Poirot interrupted softly. "I observe." As she rose to leave, Poirot noticed again the small key at her waist. This time he allowed his gaze to linger. "You are fond of clocks, Miss Pen?" he asked. She met his eyes. One cannot serve Sir Lionel without learning their ways. After she left, Poirot sat quietly for a moment. The house seemed restless, the ticking uneven. That evening, Poirot took a slow walk through the corridors. He stopped before a clock he had not examined earlier, a modest wall clock near the servants' stairs. Its case bore a recent scratch near the latch. Someone had opened it recently. In the drawing-room, Eleanor sat alone, staring into the fire. Poirot joined her without speaking. "I feel as though I have inherited more than I wished," she said suddenly. "Responsibility, secrets." Poirot regarded her kindly. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, inheritance brings not wealth, but weight." She turned to him. "You think my uncle was murdered?" Poirot did not answer directly. "Your uncle feared betrayal. Fear rarely comes without cause." She nodded slowly. "I wish I had insisted he tell me more." Later that night, Poirot returned to his room. The carriage clock on his bedside table was ticking once more. He frowned. He was certain it had stopped earlier. He bent closer. The clock was running, but imperfectly. A faint hesitation marked each turn of the mechanism. Poirot did not touch it. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Someone is restless," he murmured. He extinguished the lamp and lay back, hands folded neatly upon his chest. The house was heavy with expectation. Motives had begun to surface, but none yet aligned perfectly. Money, loyalty, fear, and time all were tangled together. And somewhere within Belvoir Chase, someone was watching the clocks, waiting for the right moment. Poirot closed his eyes, his mind already arranging the pieces. Time, he knew, would tell the truth. It always did. Chapter 4. A clock out of place. Hercule Poirot believed firmly that objects, when properly questioned, often spoke more honestly than people. At Belvoir Chase, the clocks were speaking, but not all in the same voice. One in particular troubled him more than the rest. It stood in the corner of the clock gallery, smaller than Sir Lionel's prized long-case clocks, its mahogany case polished but unremarkable. At first glance, it appeared perfectly ordinary, and that, Poirot knew, was precisely the problem. He examined it early the next morning, alone. Inspector Webb had agreed to give him the freedom of the house, though not without some reservation. "Just don't dismantle anything valuable," the inspector had said. Poirot smiled politely. "I dismantle only ideas, Inspector." The clock was running. Its tick was steady, its hands correct. Yet Poirot felt a faint dissatisfaction. He crouched slightly, bringing his eyes level with the case. There, a difference so slight it would escape most observers. The back panel sat not quite flush. It had been opened recently. Poirot did not open it himself. Instead, he straightened and made a mental note. Later that morning, he requested a quiet conversation with Mrs. Briggs in the housekeeper's sitting room. She sat, stiffly smoothing her apron. "You have worked here many years?" Poirot said gently. "Nearly 20, she replied. "Sir Lionel was a fair man, particular but fair." "Particular?" Poirot echoed. "Did he allow others to touch his clocks?" Mrs. Briggs shook her head at once. "No, sir. Only Miss Pen, and even then only when he asked." Poirot thanked her and dismissed her kindly. The answer aligned neatly with his earlier observations. Shortly afterward, he encountered Captain Calder in the garden. The man was smoking, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. "You favour the garden," Poirot remarked. Calder shrugged. Fresh air helps me think. And do you think often? Poirot asked mildly. Calder laughed, though it sounded strained. More than I like these days. Poirot gestured toward the house. The clocks, do they trouble you? They get on my nerves, Calder admitted, always ticking, always reminding one of time slipping away. Poirot inclined his head, an honest answer. Inside the house, Miss Penn was sorting papers in the study Sir Lionel had once used. She looked up calmly as Poirot entered. I am trying to bring some order, she said. Sir Lionel would have wanted that. Poirot glanced at the desk. Everything was neatly aligned, too neatly perhaps. You worked closely with Sir Lionel, Poirot said. Did he seem fearful toward the end? Miss Penn paused. Concerned, yes, he suspected errors in the accounts. Errors, Poirot repeated. Or theft. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment. He never accused anyone directly. Poirot nodded, then turned his attention to the shelves. On one lay a small leather-bound notebook. He picked it up carefully. May I? He asked. Miss Penn hesitated, then nodded. The notebook contained dates, times, and brief notations. Some entries were marked with small symbols Poirot did not immediately recognize. Sir Lionel tracked everything, Miss Penn said quickly. He believed precision was a virtue. Indeed, Poirot murmured. Yet even precision may conceal. He closed the book and returned it without comment. That afternoon, Poirot returned to the clock gallery with Inspector Webb. Together they examined the smaller mahogany clock. I don't see anything, Webb said after a moment. Poirot smiled faintly. Because you look for damage, I look for intention. With careful fingers, he opened the back panel just enough to reveal the mechanism. There, almost invisible, was a thin metal pin inserted near the escapement. Webb stared. What does that do? It allows the clock to be stopped at will, Poirot replied. Without harm, a gentle lie. Webb's expression hardened. So someone tampered with it? Yes, and not only this one. Poirot gestured to the others. The clocks that stopped on the night of Sir Lionel's death were not faulty, they were persuaded. Webb exhaled slowly. That changes matters. It clarifies them, Poirot corrected. The implication was unmistakable. Whoever interfered with the clocks possessed knowledge, access, and patience. That evening, tension settled heavily over the household. Dinner was a subdued affair. Eleanor ate little. Captain Calder drank more than usual. Miss Penn remained composed, though her eyes followed Poirot whenever she thought herself unobserved. After dinner, Poirot lingered in the drawing room. One by one, the others retired. Near midnight, Poirot heard it again, the soft, deliberate sound of a clock being opened. He rose silently and stepped into the corridor. A faint light glowed at the far end. Poirot did not rush. He moved with care, his senses alert. The light vanished. Poirot stopped before the modest wall clock near the servants' stairs. It was ticking, but faintly irregular. He leaned closer. The back panel was slightly ajar. Someone had been there moments before. Poirot closed the panel gently and returned to his room. He did not pursue. The moment was not yet ripe. Instead, he sat at his small writing desk and made several neat notes. Clocks altered deliberately, access limited, fear preceding death, false time as misdirection. He paused, tapping his pen thoughtfully. Why lie about the hour, he murmured, unless the hour itself tells a story? The answer hovered just beyond reach. As Poirot prepared for bed, he glanced once more at his carriage clock. It ticked steadily now, as though nothing were amiss. But Poirot knew better. One clock in the house was out of place, not because it stood wrongly, but because it revealed intention rather than habit. And intention, Poirot knew, was the true measure of guilt. He extinguished the lamp and lay down, his mind alert even as his body rested. Somewhere in Belvoir Chase, someone was adjusting time again. And soon, very soon, Poirot intended to stop them. Chapter 5. The Psychology of Guilt. Hercule Poirot had long maintained that guilt announced itself long before confession. It did not always appear as panic or remorse. More often, it revealed itself in restraint, in careful words chosen too precisely, in silences held just a moment too long. At Belvoir Chase, such silences had begun to multiply. The day after the discovery of the altered clock passed under a veil of uneasy politeness. The household moved as though obeying an unspoken agreement to disturb nothing further. Doors were closed gently. Voices were lowered, even the clock seemed to tick with a more cautious rhythm. Poirot spent the morning doing nothing that appeared useful. He took tea alone in the morning room, rearranging the cups until they pleased him. He read yesterday's newspaper from beginning to end. He took a slow walk through the garden, pausing to examine fallen leaves, as though they were of great interest. To an observer he might have appeared idle. In truth, he was listening. Shortly before noon, Eleanor Harrington approached him. She hesitated, then spoke. "Monsieur Poirot, may I speak with you privately?" Poirot rose at once. "But of course, mademoiselle." They sat in the small library, away from the clocks. Eleanor's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "I feel I have not been entirely honest," she said. Poirot regarded her attentively. "Honesty, when delayed, is often accompanied by fear. Please, continue." "The night my uncle died," she said slowly, "I did not spend the entire evening reading." Poirot did not react. "I went to see him," she continued. "I was worried. He had accused someone close, of stealing from him. I believed he was mistaken." "You wish to protect this person," Poirot said gently. "Yes, I asked him to stop his inquiries. He refused. We argued. I left him angry." "Did anyone see you?" "No." Poirot nodded. "And you did not return?" "No, I swear it." He studied her face. There was fear there, but not calculation. "You are not my killer, mademoiselle," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "How can you be sure?" "Because guilt that conceals murder seeks advantage. Yours seeks only escape from blame." She bowed her head. "I should have told someone." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "But truth, even delayed, has its uses." After she left, Poirot remained seated, reflecting. Eleanor's confession clarified one thing. Sir Lionel had confronted betrayal shortly before his death, but confrontation alone did not explain the clocks. That afternoon, Poirot requested Inspector Webb to arrange a review of Sir Lionel's financial records. Miss Penn provided them promptly, her efficiency beyond reproach. Poirot examined them carefully. The figures were neat, balanced, and complete. Too complete. He returned the files without comment. Later, Captain Calder sought him out. The man appeared agitated, his earlier ease gone. "You've been asking questions," Calder said, "about Lionel's money, about the clocks." "I ask questions about many things," Poirot replied mildly. Calder hesitated. "Lionel suspected me, you know, because of my debts." "Did he accuse you?" "No, but he looked at me differently, as though measuring." "And you resented this?" Calder laughed harshly. "Who wouldn't?" Poirot regarded him steadily. "Resentment explains anger. It does not explain patience." Calder flushed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Nothing at all." That evening, Poirot changed his routine. Instead of retiring early, he remained in the drawing room after dinner, pretending to doze in his chair. One by one, the others left. The house settled into its familiar quiet. Minutes passed, then more. At last, Poirot heard movement, light footsteps, a pause. Poirot did not open his eyes. A door opened softly. A faint metallic sound followed. Poirot waited. The sound came again, careful, deliberate, someone working methodically. Poirot rose silently and followed the noise to the study. The door stood ajar. Inside, Miss Penn stood at the desk, a small tool in her hand. She froze when she saw him. I was checking the clock," she said quickly. It had stopped. Poirot glanced at the clock. It was running. "You are devoted to order, Miss Penn," he said calmly. "It is my duty." "Is it also your habit to move objects without permission?" She stiffened. "Sir Lionel entrusted me with management," Poirot interrupted gently, "not with alteration." Her composure wavered, then returned. "You accuse me of nothing, Monsieur Poirot." "No," he agreed. "I accuse only time." She left without another word. Poirot remained behind, studying the clock. It bore no pin, no obvious tampering, yet its placement had changed slightly. Someone had shifted it, by inches. That night Poirot did not sleep. He sat at his desk writing. He listed behaviors rather than facts. One fears accusation, one fears exposure, one fears loss of control. Only one person, he realized, feared all three. Sir Lionel had not been killed in anger, nor in desperation. He had been killed to preserve a carefully constructed order. The clocks were not tools of opportunity. They were tools of reassurance, meant to give their user the illusion of mastery over events, a dangerous illusion. As dawn approached, Poirot closed his notebook. "The psychology of guilt," he murmured, "is not loud, it is meticulous." Outside, the clocks of Belvoir Chase continued their steady ticking. But Poirot now knew that one of them, perhaps more, was lying, and that the truth, when it came, would arrive not suddenly, but with perfect, inevitable precision. Chapter 6. A Second Disturbance. Hercule Poirot woke before dawn with the uncomfortable certainty that something in the house had changed again. It was not a sound that stirred him, nor a dream, but the quiet awareness that comes when order has been disturbed during the night. He sat up at once and reached for his bedside lamp. The carriage clock on the table beside him had stopped. Poirot did not touch it immediately. Instead, he observed, the hands rested at 22 minutes past 3. He checked his wristwatch. It was nearly 5. "So," he murmured, "you have chosen your moment." He examined the clock carefully. There was no visible damage, no obvious interference. Yet when he turned it gently, something inside shifted, a faint, deliberate resistance that should not have been there. Poirot replaced the clock precisely where it had stood. This was no accident, nor was it carelessness. It was a message. Later that morning, Poirot requested Inspector Webb's presence in the morning room. The inspector arrived with a look of weary patience. "Another clock?" Webb asked. "Yes," Poirot replied. "Mine?" Webb sighed. "You're suggesting someone entered your room?" "I am stating it," Poirot corrected gently. "And not to steal." Webb frowned. "Why risk it? Everyone knows you're watching." Poirot smiled. "Ah, Inspector, that is exactly why." He explained nothing further, but his meaning was clear enough to trouble the inspector. Word of the disturbance spread quickly. The household gathered in the drawing room, tension written plainly on their faces. Eleanor looked frightened. Captain Calder appeared angry. Miss Penn was calm, almost too calm. Poirot addressed them with polite firmness. "Someone has interfered with the clock again," he said, "this time in my room." A sharp intake of breath came from Eleanor. "This house is not safe," Calder snapped. "Someone's playing games." "Games?" Poirot repeated softly. "Yes, but games require rules, and players." He allowed the silence to stretch before continuing. "I ask you all to remain within the house today. There will be no visitors, no excursions, no misunderstandings." No one objected openly. The rest of the morning passed under watchful stillness. Poirot spent it in the clock gallery, not examining mechanisms but observing the room as a whole. He measured distances, sidelighted, the way light fell across polished cases. One detail in particular held his attention: a small chair positioned beneath the long case clock where Sir Lionel had been found. It was not placed squarely. It never had been. Sir Lionel, Poirot recalled, had been meticulous. Someone else had positioned that chair. At midday, Poirot requested lunch be served early and taken together. It was an unusual request, but complied with. The atmosphere at the table was strained. Miss Penn spoke little. Captain Calder drank water instead of wine, his jaw set. Eleanor barely touched her food. Poirot watched them all. After lunch, he asked Eleanor to walk with him in the garden. The air was cold but clear. "You are frightened," Poirot said gently. She nodded. "I feel as though the house itself is watching us." "Perhaps," Poirot said. "It is being watched." She stopped. "Do you believe the person who killed my uncle is still acting?" "Yes," Poirot replied simply. "Why?" "Because guilt is rarely satisfied with one deception." She shivered. Inside, Poirot requested access to Sir Lionel's private workshop, a small room off the gallery that had remained locked. Miss Penn produced the key at once. The workshop was immaculate. Tools hung in careful order. Drawers were labelled, yet one drawer stood slightly open. Poirot examined its contents: thin metal pins of varying lengths, some bent, some straight. Clockmaker's tools, but not all identical. "These," Poirot said quietly to Inspector Webb, who had joined him, "are not merely tools, they are choices." Webb frowned. "Meaning?" "Different lengths stop different mechanisms. Someone here knows exactly which pin to use and when." That evening, Poirot made his boldest move yet. He gathered the household in the drawing room and announced calmly, "Sir Lionel Harrington did not die at the hour his body was found." A murmur rippled through the room. "The clocks were altered to suggest a later time," Poirot continued. "Why? Because the true moment of death reveals something inconvenient." Captain Calder leaned forward. "And you know when that was?" Poirot met his gaze. "Not yet." Miss Penn's eyes flicked briefly to the mantel clock, then away. Poirot noticed. "I will know soon," he added, "when the final inconsistency presents itself." That night, Poirot did something unexpected. He left his door unlocked. He extinguished his lamp and lay still, listening. Time passed. The house breathed around him. Then, soft footsteps. A pause outside his door. Poirot did not move. The footsteps retreated. Someone, he realized, had lost their nerve. The next morning brought the final disturbance before revelation. A clock in the gallery rang once, loud, sudden, wrong. Poirot arrived moments later. The clock was still swinging, its chime echoing faintly. It had been set to strike deliberately against its nature. A signal. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he murmured. "You are ready now." He turned to Inspector Webb, his expression composed but resolute. "Inspector, please prepare yourself," he said. "Tomorrow we will speak of truth." As the echo faded, the house of Belvoir Chase seemed to hold its breath. The final reckoning was no longer a question of if, only of when. Chapter 7. The Shape of Truth. By the morning of the 7th day, Belvoir Chase felt altered in a way that could not be measured by clocks alone. The house had grown quieter, not from calm but from anticipation. Each footstep echoed too clearly. Each chime seemed to linger too long. Truth, Poirot knew, had begun to take shape, and shapes cast shadows. Hercule Poirot rose early, though he had slept little. His mind, however, was clear. He shaved with care, adjusted his tie and polished his shoes until they reflected the light precisely. Disorder of appearance, he believed, encouraged disorder of thought. When he entered the breakfast room, all eyes turned toward him. Captain Calder was already seated, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. Eleanor Harrington sat near the window, pale but composed. Mrs. Briggs moved quietly between table and sideboard, her face drawn with worry. Miss Penn arrived last, punctual as ever, her manner calm, her eyes alert. Poirot took his seat and poured himself tea. "You have all slept poorly," he observed mildly. No one contradicted him. Inspector Webb arrived shortly after, removing his coat as he entered. "I've made the arrangements you asked for," he said to Poirot. "Everyone remains on the grounds." "Excellent," Poirot replied. "Then we may proceed carefully." After breakfast, Poirot asked each member of the household to occupy themselves as usual. There would be no interviews, no confrontations. Nothing, at least outwardly, to suggest that the day would be any different from the last. Inwardly, everything was changing. Poirot spent the morning alone in the clock gallery. He did not examine the mechanisms. Instead, he sat in Sir Lionel's chair, the very one in which the man had died. From that position, the room appeared different. Angles shifted, sight lines aligned. Poirot noticed something he had not fully appreciated before. From the chair, one could see the reflection of the study door in the glass of a nearby clock case. Anyone approaching could be observed without turning one's head. Sir Lionel, Poirot realized, had been watching someone he trusted. The thought settled heavily. Later that morning, Eleanor approached Poirot quietly. "You said yesterday that the truth would come today," she said. "Does that mean—" "It means," Poirot replied gently, "that the truth has stopped hiding." She looked toward the gallery. "My uncle suspected betrayal. I see that now, but I still do not understand the clocks." Poirot smiled faintly. "The clocks are not the cause, mademoiselle. They are the language." Before she could respond, Miss Penn appeared at the doorway. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "Inspector Webb wishes to speak with you." The inspector was waiting in the study, his expression serious. "One of the clocks has been tampered with again," Webb said, "this time clumsily." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, then patience has given way to urgency." They examined the clock together. The pin inside had been inserted too deeply, damaging the escapement. "A mistake," Webb muttered. "Yes," Poirot agreed. "And mistakes are born of pressure." That afternoon, Poirot gathered the household, not for explanation, but for observation. He asked them to sit together in the drawing room while he stood near the fireplace. "I wish only to ask a question," Poirot said calmly. "No one is required to answer aloud." They watched him warily. "Which of you," Poirot continued, "believed Sir Lionel Harrington would protect them no matter what?" The silence was absolute. Poirot allowed it to stretch, watching faces, hands, breathing. Captain Calder shifted, then stilled himself. Eleanor's eyes filled with confusion. Mrs. Briggs stared at the floor. Miss Penn did not move. "Protection," Poirot went on, "is a powerful illusion. It creates loyalty. It also creates fear. Fear of losing it." He turned slightly, addressing the room as a whole. "Sir Lionel was not killed in rage, nor in desperation. He was killed because someone believed time was running out." No one spoke. That evening, Poirot took Inspector Webb aside. "Tomorrow," Poirot said, "I will explain everything. Tonight, however, the house will reveal one final truth, if we allow it." Webb frowned. "You're expecting something to happen?" "I am permitting it," Poirot replied. That night, Poirot returned to the clock gallery and did something unusual. He stopped one of the clocks himself. He inserted a pin, but deliberately incorrectly. Then he waited. Minutes passed, then footsteps. A figure entered the gallery, moving swiftly, confidently. Too confidently. Poirot stepped forward into the light. The figure froze. Poirot did not speak. He did not accuse. He merely observed. After a long moment, the figure retreated without a word. Poirot removed the pin and restarted the clock. "Yes," he murmured. "Now I see." When morning came, Poirot dressed with particular care. He sent word to Inspector Webb to summon everyone to the drawing room after breakfast. "The time has come," Poirot said quietly to himself, straightening his cuffs. "For all the clocks to agree." Downstairs, the house waited. And at last, so did the truth. Chapter 8. When all clocks agree. The drawing room at Belvoir Chase was filled with a silence unlike any that had come before. It was not tense, nor fearful, but expectant, like a pause before the final note of a carefully composed piece of music. Hercule Poirot stood near the mantel, impeccably dressed, his posture precise. Inspector Webb occupied a chair near the door, his notebook closed. Eleanor Harrington sat upright, hands folded. Captain Calder leaned back stiffly, jaw tight. Mrs. Briggs hovered near the wall, anxious. Miss Violet Penn sat straight-backed in her chair, her expression calm, her eyes attentive. Poirot surveyed them all. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice gentle, but unmistakably firm. "I thank you for your patience. The time has come to restore order, to place each event in its proper moment." He turned slightly toward the mantel clock. "This house," he continued, "has been ruled by clocks, not merely as objects of beauty or habit, but as instruments of control. Someone here believed that by adjusting time, reality itself might be rearranged." Captain Calder shifted. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on Poirot. "Let us begin," Poirot said, "with what Sir Lionel Harrington discovered shortly before his death. There were irregularities in his accounts, small, careful withdrawals disguised as legitimate expenses. They were not reckless, they were methodical." Miss Penn's hands tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Sir Lionel suspected betrayal," Poirot went on, "but suspicion alone was not enough for him. He observed, he recorded, he waited." Poirot crossed the room, slowly. On the evening of his death, Sir Lionel had already uncovered the truth. He confronted the person responsible, not publicly, but privately. That person believed themselves indispensable, protected, beyond consequence. Eleanor drew in a sharp breath. "The confrontation did not end in violence," Poirot said. "Sir Lionel was calm. He intended to act, legally, carefully, and with dignity." Poirot paused. But time, for one person in this room, was suddenly no longer an ally. Captain Calder shook his head. "You still haven't said how he died." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, Sir Lionel was poisoned, earlier in the evening, not in the clock gallery. The substance acted slowly, leaving no obvious signs. Death came quietly before anyone suspected." A murmur rippled through the room. "The body was then positioned beneath the long case clock," Poirot continued, "and the clocks were stopped deliberately, each at a slightly different moment, to confuse the investigation, to suggest uncertainty." Inspector Webb nodded grimly. "The key to this deception," Poirot said, was not mechanical knowledge alone, but psychological comfort. The murderer did not fear clocks, they trusted them. He turned at last to Miss Penn. "You, Miss Penn," Poirot said softly, "were Sir Lionel's secretary, his confidant, his most trusted assistant. You managed his accounts, you knew his habits, you knew his clocks." Miss Penn met his gaze steadily. "That proves nothing." "It proves opportunity," Poirot replied. "But more than that, it proves expectation. You believed Sir Lionel would protect you. When you realized he would not, you acted, not in panic, but in calculation." Poirot gestured gently toward the gallery. "You adjusted the clocks to mislead time itself. You believed that if the hour of death could not be fixed, neither could blame." Miss Penn's composure finally cracked. "You are mistaken," she said sharply. "You have no proof." Poirot smiled sadly. "On the contrary, the proof lies not only in mechanisms but in behavior. You returned to the clocks repeatedly, not to conceal, but to reassure yourself. Each adjustment was an attempt to regain control." He turned briefly to Eleanor. "Mademoiselle Harrington, your visit to your uncle that evening provided the murderer with a convenient shadow, a red herring, as we say." Eleanor nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. Poirot faced the room once more. "The final mistake," he said, "was impatience. When a clock was tampered with clumsily, too deeply, that was fear speaking, fear of discovery." Miss Penn rose suddenly, her voice trembling. "He was going to ruin me," she said. "I gave him everything, my loyalty, my years. He would have destroyed me." Poirot's voice softened. "No, mademoiselle. He would have corrected you. There is a difference." Inspector Webb stood. "Miss Penn, I'm afraid—" She did not resist as he approached. Her shoulders sagged, the careful order she had maintained finally collapsing. As she was led from the room, the clock seemed, for the first time, to tick in unison. Silence followed. Poirot turned to Eleanor. "Belvoir Chase is yours now," he said gently. "So is the truth." Captain Calder rose quietly and left the room without a word. Mrs. Briggs wiped her eyes. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Order," he said softly, "is not the absence of chaos, but the restoration of balance." Later that afternoon, Poirot stood alone in the clock gallery. One by one, he restarted the stopped clocks. Their ticking aligned, forming a single, steady rhythm. Time, once more, told the truth. As Poirot prepared to depart, Eleanor thanked him. "You gave my uncle justice," she said. Poirot smiled faintly. "I merely listened, to people and to time." He stepped into the waiting motor car. Behind him, Belvoir Chase stood quietly in the afternoon light, its many clocks finally in agreement, and Hercule Poirot, satisfied, allowed himself a small smile, for the case was complete and order at last restored. "The case is closed, but the next mystery is already waiting. This is unknown suspect